What happens when a man who has everything decides he wants more? Jeffrey Bowen, a titan of Silicon Valley, walked into his divorce hearing with a predator's smile. On his arm wasn't his wife of 15 years, the mother of his children, but his stunning young mistress, Helen. He believed he had the perfect plan to leave his wife, Michelle, with nothing. Not even her dignity. He was about to publicly accuse her of infidelity and demand a paternity test for their 2 children. But in the cold, quiet halls of justice, a secret was waiting. A secret locked in an envelope on the judge's desk. The air in courtroom 4B of the San Mateo County Superior Court was thick with the scent of old paper and simmering animosity. It was a sterile, impersonal space, all polished wood and muted beige walls designed to leach the passion out of human conflict. But today, it failed spectacularly. At the center of it all sat Jeffrey Bowen. He wasn't just a man, he was an institution. The founder and CEO of Aura Dynamics, a company that had revolutionized data storage. Jeffrey was handsome in that sharp, predatory way that immense wealth often bestows. His suit was custom Tom Ford, a whisper of charcoal grey that probably cost more than the court stenographer's car. And on his face, a smile. It wasn't a happy smile, it was a smile of supreme confidence, of a game already won. Beside him, in the space legally reserved for his counsel, sat Helen May. Her presence was the ultimate act of psychological warfare. She was 28, with hair the color of liquid night and a dress of crimson that defied the somber environment, a bold declaration of victory. She occasionally placed a perfectly manicured hand on Jeffrey's arm, a gesture of ownership. She was the mistress, the home wrecker, and she wore the title like a crown. Across the aisle sat Michelle Newton. If Jeffrey and Helen were a raging fire, Michelle was a frozen lake. She sat with a posture so straight it seemed carved from ice. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a simple, elegant chignon. She wore a modest navy blue dress, the kind that signals quiet dignity, not surrender. Her face was a mask of placid neutrality, her gaze fixed not on her husband or his lover, but on the formidable woman sitting elevated before them, Judge Eleanor Vance. To the outside world, this was a tragic but familiar story. The brilliant, aging billionaire discarding his loyal wife for a newer model. But Michelle knew something no one else in that room knew. She knew that the real story wasn't a cliché. It was a horror film. And she was the final girl. Her mind drifted back a year, to the last time she had felt truly secure. It was the annual Beacon of Innovation Gala. She remembered the feel of the cool silk of her gown, the weight of the diamond necklace Jeffrey had gifted her. The constellation, he'd called it. He had been incandescent that night, his arm securely around her waist. In his speech, accepting another award, he'd called her his North Star. None of this, he'd said, sweeping his arm across the glittering ballroom, would be possible without the smartest, most beautiful, and most patient woman in the world. My wife, Michelle. The room had erupted in applause. She had blushed, feeling the genuine warmth of his words, or what she'd believed was warmth. Looking back now, she realized it had been a performance. Jeffrey was the CEO of his own life, and everyone else was just an employee playing a part. The first crack in the facade had appeared 3 months later. It was small, almost insignificant. A scent on his shirt collar when he came home late from a bored dinner. It was a perfume she didn't recognize, a heavy, musky floral. Jasmine and oud. She had asked him about it, and he'd laughed it off. Must have been Susan from marketing. You know how she practically bathes in that stuff. But a week later, a charge appeared on their joint Amex statement. La Perla. $2,140. He didn't buy her lingerie from La Perla. He knew she found it impractical. When she questioned him, his casual explanation was ready. A gift for my sister's birthday, darling. Forgot to tell you. His sister's birthday was 6 months away. The small cracks spiderwebbed, branching out into undeniable fissures. Late nights became more frequent. Business trips extended without notice. He grew distant, his phone guarded like a state secret, its screen angled away from her whenever she entered a room. The easy intimacy they had shared for 15 years evaporated, replaced by a polite, formal chill. He still played the part of the family man on weekends, taking their children, 12-year-old Leo and 8-year-old Chloe, to the park, but his eyes were elsewhere. He was a ghost in their sprawling Atherton mansion. Michelle wasn't a fool. She had a master's degree in art history from Yale, specializing in detecting forgeries. She knew how to look for inconsistencies, for the brushstroke that didn't belong, for the pigment that was anachronistic, and her husband's life had become a poorly executed fake. The pain was a physical thing, a constant, dull ache in her chest. The nights were the worst, lying alone in their king-sized bed, the empty space beside her, a cold, gaping wound. She cried until she had no tears left, her grief raw and suffocating. Then, one rain-swept Tuesday, grief turned to ice-cold clarity. That was the day she found it, the day everything changed. She had been helping Chloe with a school project on the family iPad, which was still logged into Jeffrey's iCloud account. An email notification flashed on the screen. The sender was Marcus Thorne, Jeffrey's notoriously ruthless corporate lawyer. The subject line was simply, Project Phoenix, Asset Realignment. Curiosity warred with her sense of privacy. She clicked. Her blood ran cold as she read. It wasn't a corporate project. It was a detailed plan, a meticulously crafted strategy for his divorce from her. It outlined the creation of offshore shell corporations in the Cayman Islands, the transferring of marital assets into untraceable accounts, and a strategy to devalue his stock options on paper. Project Phoenix was a blueprint for how to leave his wife with the bare minimum the law would allow, protecting the vast majority of his $500 million fortune. But it was the last paragraph that made her gasp, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a sob. Phase 4. Character leverage. To ensure a favorable custody arrangement and to counter any claims of spousal support based on lifestyle, we will contest paternity of the children. This will immediately place M on the defensive, portray her as untrustworthy and morally compromised, and shift the narrative in our favor. We will leak this to our media contacts at the appropriate moment. They were going to say Leo and Chloe weren't his. Her children, her babies, the man she had loved, the man who had tucked their children into bed and read them stories, was planning to disown them in a court of law as a financial strategy. He was going to brand her an adulteress and bastardize his own son and daughter to save money. In that moment, something inside Michelle shifted. The heartbroken wife died, and a warrior was born. The pain in her chest didn't vanish, but it crystallized into something hard and sharp. Rage. He had mistaken her kindness for weakness. He had mistaken her devotion for stupidity. He was about to find out how catastrophically wrong he was. Her mind, trained to deconstruct masterpieces and expose fakes, began to work with a terrifying lucidity. This wasn't a painting. It was a battle plan. And he had just handed it to her. Her hands trembled, but her actions were precise. She took a screenshot of the entire email chain. She airdropped it to her own phone, then created a new, encrypted email account and sent it to herself as a backup. Then she went into Jeffrey's account on the iPad, moved the original email to the trash, and then permanently deleted it from the trash folder. She cleared the device's cache. He would never know she had seen it. She looked at her reflection in the dark screen of the device. The tear-streaked, betrayed woman was gone. In her place was a stranger with cold, determined eyes. Jeffrey had started a war. He just didn't realize she was already 2 steps ahead of him, armed with his own battle plan. And she had a weapon he could never have anticipated. The truth. The day after discovering Project Phoenix, Michelle Newton made 2 phone calls. The first was to a man named Joe Shook. They had known each other since college. While Michelle pursued art history, Joe had gone to Stanford Law. He was now a partner at a boutique family law firm in San Francisco, known for his sharp intellect and his quiet, bulldog tenacity. He wasn't a media hound like Jeffrey's lawyer. He was a strategist who won his cases in the discovery phase, not in the headlines. They met in a discreet coffee shop in No Valley, far from the prying eyes of the Silicon Valley elite. Michelle laid it all out, the suspicions, the coldness, the email. She slid her phone across the table, showing him the screenshot of the battle plan. Joe read it, his expression hardening with each line. When he got to the part about contesting paternity, he looked up at her, his dark eyes filled with a mixture of disbelief and fury. "The absolute arrogance," he whispered, shaking his head. "This isn't just divorce, Michelle. This is scorched earth. He's planning to psychologically annihilate you and use your children as ammunition. This document, this is malpractice. This is malicious prosecution waiting to happen." "I know," Michelle said, her voice steady. "He thinks I'll crumble. He's expecting tears and hysterics. He's not expecting a fight. So, what do you want to do?" Joe asked, leaning forward. "We can file first. We can use this email to show intent, get a judge to freeze his assets." "No," Michelle said, cutting him off. Her voice was firm. That's what he'd expect. He'd counter, claim the email was a fabrication. He'd bog us down in motions for years. His lawyer is a shark. We can't meet him on his own terms. We have to let him walk into his own trap. Joe looked at her, a newfound respect in his eyes. "Tell me what you're thinking." "He wants to contest paternity," Michelle said, a chill in her tone. "He wants to stand up in court and accuse me of being an unfaithful wife and a liar. He wants to demand a DNA test." She paused, letting the weight of the words hang in the air. "So we're going to give it to him. But we're going to have the results before he even asks the question." Joe Shook's eyebrows shot up. "A private DNA test. Without a court order, Michelle, the chain of custody would be difficult to establish. He could claim we tampered with the samples. We won't use it as evidence, Joe," she explained, her plan taking shape even as she spoke. "We will use it as knowledge. Knowledge is power. We'll know the answer. We'll let him make his vile accusation in open court. We'll let him humiliate me. We'll let the judge order the official test. And when the results come back, his own motion will be the instrument of his destruction. He won't just be proven wrong. He'll be exposed as a malicious liar and a fraud in front of the entire world. His character, the very thing he's trying to attack, will be irrevocably destroyed by his own hand." A slow smile spread across Joe Shook's face. "Michelle Newton, you're more ruthless than he is." "He taught me," she replied, her gaze unwavering. "He just doesn't know what a good student I was." Her second phone call was to a discreet private investigation firm. The man she hired was a former SFPD detective named Frank Peterson, a gruff, no-nonsense man in his late 50s. She didn't need him to prove the affair. Jeffrey's own sloppiness had already done that. She needed him for 2 things: to document the scale of the infidelity for the court and to obtain the crucial DNA sample. "I need a sample of my husband's DNA," she told Frank in his cluttered, anonymous office. "A hair, a used coffee cup, anything. But it has to be obtained cleanly. And he can never know. Frank nodded, unfazed. The office is easiest. People shed DNA everywhere. We'll get it. While Frank went to work, Michelle began her own quiet campaign. She played the part of the oblivious, slightly sad wife perfectly. She continued to manage the household, attend school functions for Leo and Chloe, and host the occasional dinner party. She smiled politely at Jeffrey during the rare moments they were together, a serene mask hiding the raging fire beneath. He mistook her calm for resignation, her quietness for defeat. His arrogance was her greatest ally. Frank delivered 2 weeks later. His team had tailed Jeffrey and Helen to a luxury hotel in Carmel for a weekend conference. He provided Michelle with a folder containing dozens of high-resolution photos. Jeffrey and Helen kissing by the pool, holding hands at dinner, entering their hotel room together. It was clinical, irrefutable proof, but the most important thing he delivered was a small evidence bag. Inside was a single disposable coffee cup from Starbucks. He tossed it in a public can on his way into the office this morning, Frank said. It's all yours. The next step was the most painful. She had to get samples from her own children. She waited until they were asleep. She crept into Leo's room first, the moonlight streaming through his window, illuminating the face of the boy who had his father's eyes. Her heart ached. This felt like a betrayal, but she knew it was a necessary shield to protect him from a far greater one. With a tiny pair of sterile scissors, she snipped a small, unnoticeable lock of his hair from the nape of his neck. She did the same to Chloe, her daughter's soft blonde hair like silk between her fingers. She sealed them in separate bags. She used a sterile cheek swab on herself, then packaged all 3 samples, the coffee cup, the 2 locks of hair, and her own swab, and sent them via a medical courier to a highly reputable DNA lab in another state, one that specialized in discreet, legally defensible testing. The order form was filed under J. Shook, not her name. Every link in the chain had to be untraceable back to her. While she waited for the results, Jeffrey made his move. He sat her down in their cavernous living room, the one with the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the bay. He didn't look at her, focusing instead on a point on the far wall. "Michelle, this isn't working," he began, his voice devoid of emotion. "We've grown apart. I think it's time we went our separate ways. I've spoken to my lawyer, and he'll be in touch with yours." Michelle had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in her mind. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She simply nodded. "I see." Her lack of reaction seemed to annoy him. He was expecting a scene. "I'll be generous, of course," he said, the lie tasting like ash in her own mouth. "I want what's best for the children." "Of course," she said, her voice a perfect imitation of weary acceptance. He finally looked at her. A flicker of something, was it pity or contempt, in his eyes. "I'll be moving out tomorrow. I've taken a penthouse in the city. My assistant will arrange to have my things packed." "Fine," she said. He stood up, clearly unnerved by her composure. This wasn't going according to his script. He walked out of the room without another word. The next day, he was gone. 2 days later, Joe Shook received the official divorce filing from Marcus Thorne, and it was exactly as the email had promised. Jeffrey was petitioning for sole custody, citing Michelle's instability. And there, on page 4, was the bombshell clause. And furthermore, the petitioner has grave reason to believe he is not the biological father of the 2 children born during the marriage, and will be motioning the court to compel a paternity test to resolve this matter. The news, when it was inevitably leaked to the press, was a Category 5 hurricane. The headlines were brutal. Tech mogul's divorce, shocker, wife's secret betrayal, and Bowen paternity bombshell. Who's the father? Michelle became a pariah overnight. Mothers at her children's private school would turn their backs when she approached. She was photographed by paparazzi, looking haggard on her way to the grocery store. Online, the trolls were merciless, calling her a gold digger, a liar, an adulteress who had trapped a great man. Jeffrey and Helen, meanwhile, were photographed looking somber and united, a portrait of two people bravely facing a devastating betrayal. Through it all, Michelle remained silent. She deactivated her social media. She instructed Leo and Chloe's school to allow no media on the premises. She became a recluse in her own home, her only contact with the outside world being Joe Shook. "The pressure is immense, Michelle," he told her over the phone. "They're painting a narrative, and right now we're letting them." "Let them," Michelle replied, her voice calm. "Let them build the pedestal as high as they want. It will make the fall that much more spectacular." The day before the first court hearing, a secure, encrypted email arrived from the DNA lab. Joe Shook opened it in his office, with Michelle on a video call. It was a simple PDF document, a series of charts and numbers, but at the bottom was a summary. Match probability: Jeffrey Bowen and Leo Bowen. 99.99928%. Match probability: Jeffrey Bowen and Chloe Bowen. 99.99999%. Michelle closed her eyes, a single hot tear finally escaping and tracing a path down her cheek. It wasn't a tear of sadness, it was a tear of vindication. "We have it," Joe said, his voice filled with grim satisfaction. "The silver bullet." "Good," Michelle said, opening her eyes. They were clear and cold as a winter sky. "Now, we just let him load the gun and point it at his own head." The pre-trial hearing was a formality, but a crucial one. It was where Jeffrey's team would formally introduce their motion to compel the paternity test. They met in Judge Vance's chambers, a room that felt more like a library, lined with leather-bound legal books. Jeffrey was there, exuding a somber confidence. Marcus Thorne did all the talking, his voice smooth and reasonable as he laid out their unfortunate but necessary request. "Your Honor," Thorne began, "my client did not come to this decision lightly. It is with a heavy heart that he must confront the possibility of a profound deception. For the sake of his own peace of mind, and for the future well-being and clarity of the children, we believe a paternity test is the only way to move forward with a foundation of truth." Judge Vance, a woman in her 60s with sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing, listened without expression. She looked over at Joe and Michelle. "Mr. Shook, your response." Joe stood. "Your Honor, my client finds this accusation to be baseless, insulting, and deeply malicious. It is a transparent attempt to harm her reputation and gain leverage in these proceedings. It is character assassination, plain and simple." Michelle sat motionless, her hands clasped in her lap, her gaze fixed on the judge. She played her part to perfection, radiating the quiet devastation of a falsely accused woman. Thorne smirked. "If the accusation is baseless, then your client should have no objection to a simple test to clear her name. Her resistance only fuels my client's concerns. It was the moment of the pivot. Joe had coached her for this. He paused as if considering his options. My client is not resistant to the truth, Mr. Thorne. She is disgusted by the lie. He turned back to the judge. However, to put an end to this vile and public speculation, and to protect her children from further uncertainty, she will consent. Let the court order the test. Let's have the truth, once and for all. Jeffrey's eyes flickered with triumph. He had won. He had forced her hand. He gave Michelle a look of cold pity. Judge Vance nodded curtly. Very well. The court orders a medically certified DNA test for Mr. Bowen and the two minor children, Leo and Chloe Bowen. The samples will be collected by a court-appointed lab. The results will be delivered directly to this court, sealed to be opened at the next hearing. Is that understood? Yes, Your Honor, both lawyers said in unison. The trap was now officially set, baited and sanctioned by the legal system itself. In the weeks that followed, while the court-ordered sample collection took place, Joe Shook's team of forensic accountants waged a different kind of war. Marcus Thorne's office had responded to their financial discovery requests with a deluge of paper, thousands of pages of irrelevant documents, a classic hide-the-needle-in-a-haystack tactic. But Joe's team had a map, the Project Phoenix email. They weren't searching blindly. They were looking for specific shell corporations mentioned in the document. Phoenix Holdings Limited, Blue Heron Investments Inc., Nightingale Trust. He thinks he's smarter than everyone, Joe told Michelle during one of their nightly calls. Men like Jeffrey believe rules are for other people. They get sloppy. He's moved millions, but he's left a trail. We just have to find it. And then they struck gold. A junior accountant, fueled by caffeine and spite, found the thread. Following the breadcrumbs from a single wire transfer, they unraveled a network of accounts stretching from the Cayman Islands to Switzerland. They found Phoenix Holdings, just as the email had described. They documented over $150 million in marital assets, cash, stocks, property deeds that had been systematically and illegally siphoned off into these accounts in the 6 months before Jeffrey filed for divorce. It was a clear-cut case of criminal fraud, but they found something else, something even more damning. As they dug into the transfers, they noticed a recurring payment, a monthly transfer of $50,000 from one of the offshore accounts to a private trust. The beneficiary of the trust, Helen May. This changes everything, Joe said, showing Michelle the bank trails on a secure video call. She's not just the other woman. She's a paid co-conspirator. She knew about the hidden assets. She was benefiting from them. She is just as culpable as he is. Michelle looked at the printouts, her expression unreadable. She thought of Helen's smug look, her crimson dress, her hand on Jeffrey's arm in the courtroom. It wasn't love. It was a business transaction. One more thing, Michelle, Joe said, his voice low. He shared another document on the screen. It was a background check on Helen May. Her social media is pristine, very carefully curated. But you can't erase everything. My investigator dug deep. Look at this. He pointed to a cached wedding website from 2 years prior. It was for Helen May and Dr. Alistair Finch, a respectable cardiologist. The website was full of smiling photos, testimonials about their love, a registry. But the wedding had never happened. It had been called off just a few weeks before the date. He called it off? Michelle asked. No, Joe said. She did. According to my investigator's source, a jilted bridesmaid, she broke it off very suddenly, said she'd met someone who could give her the life she deserved. This was about 18 months ago, right when Frank's PI report suggests the affair with Jeffrey started. Exactly, Joe confirmed. She dropped a cardiologist for a billionaire, but it gets better. My investigator found Alistair Finch. He's still heartbroken, and he's angry. He said Helen became obsessed with Jeffrey Bowen after her marketing firm was hired to do some work for Aura Dynamics. He said she talked about him constantly, and he said that just before she broke off the engagement, she told him something she thought was a brilliant plan. Joe leaned in, his voice barely a whisper. She told her fiancé that her new man was in a dead-end marriage and that they had a plan to get him out. A plan that involved him discovering his wife had cheated on him so he could protect his assets and get custody of the kids. Alistair thought she was crazy, delusional. He never imagined it was real. Michelle stared at Joe, her mind reeling. This wasn't just a conspiracy between Jeffrey and his lawyer. Helen was in on it from the beginning. She wasn't just a passenger. She was in the driver's seat. "Can you get him to testify? Or sign an affidavit?" Michelle asked, her voice shaking with the magnitude of this revelation. Joe smiled. "Dr. Finch is a man of principle and a man of scorn. He has already signed a sworn affidavit. We have her. We have both of them." They now had a three-pronged attack: the paternity trap, the financial fraud, and the conspiracy confirmed by the mistress's own ex-fiancé. The stage was no longer just set. It was wired with explosives, and Jeffrey and Helen were about to walk right to the center of it, smiling. The morning of the hearing arrived draped in a thick coastal fog that seemed to muffle the entire city. Michelle chose her armor carefully. The same simple navy blue dress. It was her uniform of quiet resolve. As she drove to the courthouse with Joe, she felt a strange sense of calm. The fear and anxiety that had plagued her for months had been burned away, leaving only a cold, hard clarity. They entered courtroom 4B to a scene of barely controlled chaos. The gallery was packed. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks. Marcus Thorne was holding court with a few journalists, speaking in low, confidential tones. And then Jeffrey arrived. He walked in as if onto a movie set where he was the star. The smile was back, broader and more self-assured than ever. On his arm again was Helen May in a cream-colored dress that hugged her curves. They were a vision of power and victory. They took their seats, Jeffrey nodding curtly at his lawyer, completely ignoring Michelle. He didn't even glance in her direction. To him, she was already a ghost, a footnote in his triumphant new life. "All rise," the bailiff called out, as Judge Eleanor Vance swept into the room, her black robes flowing behind her. She sat, her face an impassive mask, and surveyed the room over her spectacles. The ambient noise died instantly. "We are here today to continue the divorce proceedings of Newton versus Bowen," Judge Vance began, her voice crisp and authoritative. "The main order of business is to unseal and announce the results of the court-ordered paternity test. Mr. Thorne, since this was your motion, I assume you are eager to proceed." "We are, Your Honor," Marcus Thorne said, rising to his feet. He shot a look of theatrical sympathy towards his client. "Mr. Bowen is prepared to face the truth, however painful." Michelle could feel Jeffrey's smug energy radiating across the aisle. He leaned forward slightly in his chair like a sprinter in the starting blocks, waiting for the gunshot that would signal his victory. Helen placed a reassuring hand on his back. Judge Vance picked up a large, sealed manila envelope from her desk. The seal of the court-appointed laboratory was visible in crimson wax. With a small, sharp letter opener, she slid it open. The sound was unnaturally loud in the silent room. She slid out a single sheet of paper and unfolded it. She read it to herself first, her eyes scanning the page. For a fleeting second, her expressionless facade seemed to crack. A flicker of something, disgust, surprise, crossed her features before being suppressed. She looked up, her gaze moving from the paper directly to Jeffrey Bowen. "Mr. Bowen," she said, her voice like chipping ice. "The court is in receipt of the official, notarized DNA analysis." The entire room held its breath. Jeffrey's smile was frozen on his face. "According to the results," Judge Vance continued, her voice ringing with clarity, "the probability of you, Jeffrey Michael Bowen, being the biological father of the child, Leo James Bowen, is 99.98%. A collective gasp went through the gallery. Jeffrey's smile didn't just falter, it shattered. The color drained from his face, leaving behind a pasty, slack-jawed mask of disbelief. He stared at the judge, as if she'd just started speaking in a foreign language. Judge Vance wasn't finished. "Furthermore, the probability of you, Jeffrey Michael Bowen, being the biological father of the child, Chloe Ann Bowen, is 99.999%. She laid the paper down flat on her desk. Let the record show that the paternity of the children is, by your own motion, Mr. Bowen, established beyond any scientific doubt. You are their father. The silence that followed was deafening. Jeffrey swiveled his head to look at Marcus Thorne, his eyes wide with panic and fury. Thorne looked just as stunned, his mouth slightly agape. Helen's hand, which had been on Jeffrey's back, was snatched away as if she'd touched a hot stove. Her face was a canvas of pure shock. This was it, the first detonation. But Michelle and Joe knew it was just the prelude. Before Thorne could recover and stammer out a response, Joe Shook stood up. "Your Honor," he said, his voice calm but carrying to every corner of the room. Judge Vance turned her piercing gaze to him. "Mr. Shook, given that Mr. Bowen's central claim, a claim he and his counsel have viciously and publicly prosecuted, has now been proven to be a categorical and malicious falsehood, we have several matters to bring to the court's attention." Thorne finally found his voice. "Objection. This is not on the docket." "Overruled," Judge Vance snapped, her eyes narrowing at Thorne. "You opened this door, counsel. You put Ms. Newton's character and morality on public trial based on a lie. I'm inclined to hear what Mr. Shook has to say. Proceed." Joe nodded. "Thank you, Your Honor. For the past several months, my client has been the subject of a ruthless smear campaign, all based on the lie that was just exposed. But Mr. Bowen's deception runs far deeper than character assassination. He has also engaged in a systematic and illegal campaign to defraud my client of her rightful share of the marital estate." He walked to the clerk and handed over a thick binder. "Your Honor, this is a full forensic accounting report. It details the creation of numerous offshore shell corporations with names like Phoenix Holdings and documents the illegal transfer of over 150 million of marital assets into these untraceable accounts in the 6 months prior to Mr. Bowen filing for divorce." A wave of shock rolled through the courtroom, 10 times more powerful than the first. Reporters were writing so fast their pens seemed to smoke. Jeffrey looked like he had been physically struck. He was no longer a predator. He was prey, caught in the glare of a spotlight. "This is an outrage!" Thorne bellowed, but his protest lacked conviction. He looked panicked. "It is indeed an outrage, Mr. Thorne," Judge Vance said coldly, flipping through the first few pages of the binder. "It appears to be a prima facie case of felony fraud and perjury, given the financial disclosures Mr. Bowen has already submitted to this court." She looked up at Jeffrey again, her eyes filled with undisguised contempt. "Mr. Bowen, you are in a catastrophic amount of legal trouble." But Joe Shook wasn't done. "And finally, Your Honor," he said, his voice dropping slightly, drawing everyone in. "This entire painful charade, the false accusations, the public humiliation of my client, the attempt to disown his own children, was not a spontaneous act of a misguided man. It was a premeditated conspiracy." He turned his body slightly to include not just Jeffrey, but Helen in his line of sight. A conspiracy not just between Mr. Bowen and his legal team, but one that actively involved his mistress, Miss Helen May. Helen, who had been shrinking in her seat, now looked up, her eyes wide with terror. "Objection, Your Honor. He's baselessly attacking a civilian in this courtroom," Thorne yelled. "Is it baseless, Mr. Shook?" Judge Vance asked, her voice dangerously quiet. "No, Your Honor," Joe replied. He produced another document. "This is a sworn and notarized affidavit from a Dr. Alistair Finch." At the mention of the name, all the blood drained from Helen's face. She looked at Jeffrey, a desperate, pleading look in her eyes. But Jeffrey wasn't looking at her. He was staring at Joe Shook with pure, unadulterated hatred. "Dr. Finch," Joe continued, "was Ms. May's fiancé, until she abruptly broke off their engagement 18 months ago to begin her affair with the married Mr. Bowen. In his affidavit, Dr. Finch testifies under penalty of perjury that Ms. May outlined their entire plan to him, a plan where she and Mr. Bowen would manufacture a narrative of wifely infidelity, allowing Mr. Bowen to file for divorce, hide his assets, and contest paternity to gain full custody and leave his wife with nothing. She described it to her fiancé as their perfect plan. David let the words hang in the air. The second and most powerful detonation. The courtroom erupted. The judge banged her gavel, but it was useless against the tide of shock and outrage. Helen May snapped. Her carefully constructed facade of sophisticated calm crumbled into dust. She stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the floor, and pointed a trembling finger at Geoffrey. You told me it would work!" she shrieked, her voice shrill with panic. "You told me she would break. You told me your lawyers had it all handled. You promised me everything." Geoffrey looked at her, his face a mask of utter contempt. "Shut up, you fool," he hissed. But it was too late. Her public outburst was a confession. She had just admitted to the entire conspiracy in open court. Judge Vance slammed her gavel down. 3 sharp, deafening cracks. "Silence!" she roared, her voice booming with authority. The room finally fell quiet. She pointed a finger at Helen. "Ms. May, you will sit down and you will not say another word, or I will have you removed and held in contempt." Then she fixed her glacial stare on Geoffrey Bowen. "Mr. Bowen, your actions in this courtroom and prior to it are the most reprehensible I have seen in my 15 years on this bench. You have committed perjury. You have committed fraud. You have maliciously attempted to defraud your wife and traumatize your own children for financial gain. You have abused the justice system and made a mockery of this court." She leaned forward. "This divorce proceeding is now the least of your problems. I am referring this entire case, the financial fraud, the perjury, the conspiracy, to the district attorney's office for immediate criminal investigation." She looked at the court officer. "The evidence binders from Mr. Shook are to be sealed and delivered to the DA by end of day." She looked at Marcus Thorne. "And you, counsel, you are dangerously close to being implicated in this conspiracy. I would advise you to retain your own lawyer." Finally, her gaze softened just for a moment as she looked at Michelle. It was a look of profound respect. Michelle met her gaze and gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. She had not said a word. She hadn't needed to. Geoffrey Bowen, the billionaire titan, the master of the universe, sat slumped in his chair, utterly broken. His smile was gone, replaced by the vacant, terrified look of a man whose world had just been utterly and completely obliterated by a truth he had been too arrogant to even consider. The aftermath was swift and brutal. The story wasn't just news, it was a global phenomenon. Billionaire's divorce plot implodes. Fraud, perjury, and a fake paternity scandal screamed the headlines. The narrative Geoffrey had so carefully constructed was shattered, and the shrapnel tore his reputation to shreds. Geoffrey Bowen was arrested 2 days later. The image of the titan of industry in handcuffs, his face pale and haggard, being led into a police car became the defining photo of his downfall. The board of Aura Dynamics convened an emergency meeting and summarily fired him as CEO. The company's stock plunged over 40%, wiping out billions in value. Marcus Thorne, facing disbarment and a potential indictment, immediately cut a deal with the district attorney, agreeing to testify against his former client. Helen May vanished, fired from her job and facing her own legal jeopardy. She became a ghost. For Michelle, the victory was quiet, but total. With Geoffrey's assets unfrozen, and his fraud laid bare, the divorce settlement was swift and staggering. She was awarded 60% of the marital estate. She received full legal and physical custody of Leo and Chloe. She also won ownership of the Atherton mansion. But Michelle didn't want the mansion. It was a gilded cage filled with the ghosts of lies. The first thing she did was put it on the market. 6 months later, the dust had begun to settle. Jeffrey was out on bail, awaiting a criminal trial he was almost certain to lose. Michelle and her children were living in a beautiful, light-filled home in Marin County. It was smaller, but it felt infinitely larger. It was a home, not a showroom. She had rediscovered the woman she was before she became Mrs. Jeffrey Bowen. She had started a small, private art consultancy firm, advising collectors and authenticating pieces, the very skills she had used to deconstruct her husband's web of lies. One crisp autumn afternoon, she was sitting on her back porch, a cup of tea warming her hands, watching her children play on the lawn. They were laughing. Leo looked up and caught her eye, giving her a wide, easy smile. It was a genuine smile, full of love and security. It was everything Jeffrey's smile had never been. Joe came to visit, bringing paperwork. They sat on the porch together. "You know," he said, looking out at the yard, "I've handled hundreds of divorce cases. Most end with bitterness. I've never seen one end with, well, with this." "With what?" Michelle asked. "With peace," he said. "He set out to destroy you, Michelle. Instead, you found yourself." She considered his words. In the fire of Jeffrey's betrayal, she had been forged into someone stronger. She had lost a husband and a life she thought she wanted, but she had gained herself and a future that was entirely her own. A breeze rustled through the trees, carrying the sound of her children's laughter. She took a deep breath, and for the first time in a very long time, she felt completely and utterly free. Michelle's story is a powerful reminder that the truth is the one weapon that never fails. It shows that integrity and strength are not about how loudly you can shout, but how patiently you can plan, and how bravely you can stand in your own conviction, even when the world is against you. Jeffrey Bowen walked into that courtroom believing his money and power made him invincible. He forgot that the most powerful forces on earth, a mother's love and the simple, elegant truth, cannot be bought, bullied, or beaten. If this story of justice and vindication moved you, please hit that like button to show your support. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that strength comes in many forms and the truth will always come to light. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more incredible true stories of deception, survival, and ultimate triumph. What part of Michelle's strategy impressed you the most? Let us know in the comments below. The sound that broke her world wasn't a scream or a crash. It was laughter. A woman's laughter, light and melodic, echoing from the master bedroom she and Rodney had designed together. Dorothy Brown, 7 months pregnant and carrying a bag of organic groceries, stood frozen in the marble foyer of her own home. The scent of an unfamiliar, expensive perfume, something sharp and floral, not her subtle vanilla, clung to the air. Then she saw them. A pair of impossibly high, blood-red stilettos kicked carelessly onto the Persian rug. They weren't hers. And in that silent, suffocating moment, Dorothy knew her life was a lie. The western Massachusetts air was thick with the late August humidity, promising a thunderstorm that had yet to break. Dorothy felt a similar pressure building inside her chest as she pushed the heavy oak door shut behind her. The click of the lock sounded like a gunshot in the cavernous silence, a silence immediately betrayed by another ripple of that musical laughter from upstairs. Her hands, slick with sweat, tightened on the paper grocery bags. Kale, quinoa, prenatal vitamins, the mundane ingredients for a life she thought was real. She set the bags down on the polished granite island in the kitchen, her movements slow, deliberate, as if she were a visitor in a museum of her own life. Everything was pristine. The stainless steel Sub-Zero refrigerator, the gleaming Wolf range, the custom cabinetry that cost more than her parents' first house. Rodney Searles demanded perfection, and Dorothy had, for 10 years, been the perfect curator of his perfect world. Her bare feet made no sound on the cool travertine floors as she moved towards the grand, curving staircase. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the soft, steady rhythm of the baby kicking inside her. Breathe, Dorothy. Just breathe. But the air was too thin, stolen by the woman upstairs. Halfway up the stairs, she heard his voice, low and laced with an amusement she hadn't heard directed at her in years. Easy, Tanya. We have time. She's at her yoga class. Tanya. The name was a shard of glass in her throat. Tanya Dykes, the new VP of marketing at Rodney's private equity firm. Dorothy had met her once at a company gala. She was young, sharp, with a predatory smile and a designer dress that seemed poured onto her body. Dorothy had felt matronly and invisible beside her then, and now she understood why. She reached the top of the stairs, her hand tracing the cool, smooth wood of the banister. The door to their bedroom was ajar. Pushing it open felt like pushing open the door to a tomb, and there they were. Rodney, her husband of a decade, the man whose child she carried, was standing in only his suit trousers, his back to her. Before him, perched on the edge of their bed, was Tanya Dykes, clad in a black silk robe that Dorothy recognized as her own. The red stilettos in the foyer now made a horrifying kind of sense. Tanya was laughing, tilting her head back as Rodney leaned in to kiss her neck. The world went silent. The blood rushing in Dorothy's ears drowned out every sound except the frantic thumping of her own heart. Rodney, her voice was a rasp, a dry leaf skittering across pavement. It was barely a whisper, but it cut through the moment like a surgeon's scalpel. He froze. His head snapped up, and he turned slowly, his eyes widening in a fleeting expression of panic before settling into a familiar mask of annoyance. It was the same look he gave her when she overcooked his steak, or when a stock he'd invested in dipped by 1/4 of a point. "Dorothy," he said, his voice level, controlled. "What are you doing home so early?" Tanya Dykes slid off the bed, clutching the silk robe tighter around herself. Her face, a mask of expertly applied makeup, showed a flicker of triumph. She wasn't ashamed. She was victorious. "My class was cancelled," Dorothy said, her gaze locked on Rodney. She could feel the baby shifting, a turmoil of limbs mirroring her own inner chaos. "Obviously, I should have called first. I seemed to be interrupting." Rodney ran a hand through his perfectly coiffed dark hair. He took a step towards her, away from Tanya, a subconscious act of distancing. "Look, Dory, let's not be dramatic. It's not what it looks like." The lie was so blatant, so insulting, it almost made her laugh. "Not what it looks like," she repeated, her voice trembling. She gestured with a shaking hand towards Tanya, who was now watching them with a detached curiosity, like a scientist observing rats in a maze. "Then what is it, Rodney? What exactly am I looking at?" "It was a mistake," he said, his tone shifting from annoyance to placating. It was his deal-closing voice, the one he used to charm investors and crush opponents. "Tanya was just... We had a stressful week. It meant nothing." "It meant enough for her to be wearing my robe in our bed," Dorothy shot back, a surge of adrenaline cutting through the shock. Tanya finally spoke, her voice smooth as polished stone. "Maybe you should go, Dorothy. Give him some space to think." The sheer audacity of it, stole Dorothy's breath. To be told to leave her own home by the woman sleeping with her husband. Dorothy's gaze swung to her. "You will not speak to me. You will get your things, and you will get out of my house." Rodney stepped in between them. "Enough. Dorothy, calm down. You're pregnant. You can't get this worked up." He was using their baby as a shield, a tool to manage her. "Don't you dare," she whispered, the words raw with pain. "Don't you dare use our child to excuse this, to excuse her. It's a fling, Dorothy. It happens," he finally exploded, his frustration boiling over. The charming facade cracked, revealing the ugly entitlement beneath. "My God, you act like this is the end of the world. We'll get past it. People do." He didn't understand. He thought this was a line item on a balance sheet, a temporary dip that could be corrected. He couldn't see that he had just taken a sledgehammer to the very foundation of her life. The house, the marriage, the future she was carrying inside her. It was all a house of glass, and he had just shattered every last pane. "No," she said, her voice suddenly clear and calm, the eye of her own personal hurricane. "We won't be getting past this." She turned, not looking at either of them again. She walked down the stairs, each step a measured, agonizing movement. She picked up her car keys from the bowl by the door, her hand not even shaking anymore. She was numb, a ghost in her own home. "Dorothy, where are you going?" Rodney called from the top of the stairs. "Don't be ridiculous. We need to talk about this." She paused with her hand on the doorknob. She could hear the first fat drops of rain beginning to spatter against the windows. The promised storm had finally arrived. Without turning around, she said, "There's nothing left to talk about." She walked out the door and into the rain, leaving the keys to the Mercedes on the porch. She didn't look back. She didn't have a destination. She just knew she could never, ever come back. The life she had known was over. The rain fell in blinding sheets, blurring the manicured lawns and stone facades of Weston into a watercolor wash of greens and greys. Dorothy drove, her hands gripping the wheel of her modest Honda CR-V, the car Rodney called her errand mobile, with a white-knuckled intensity. She had no destination, only a direction. Away. Each mile put between her and the glass house was a small, defiant breath of air in her suffocating new reality. For the first hour, she was on autopilot, her mind a maelstrom of shock and betrayal. The image of Tanya in her robe, of Rodney's annoyed expression, played on a torturous loop. Tears streamed down her face, mingling with the rain on the window she'd cracked open, needing to feel something real. But as the initial wave of grief subsided, it was replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. Dorothy had spent 10 years subsumed by Rodney's life. She'd given up her promising career in art curation to become Mrs. Searles, a role that involved managing 3 properties, organizing charity galas, and ensuring Rodney's life ran with frictionless perfection. She had become an accessory, and like any outdated accessory, she had just been replaced. The power imbalance in their relationship had always been there, a silent undercurrent. It was his name, his money, his world. She had simply been allowed to live in it. Now, cast out, she felt a terrifying, dizzying sense of freedom. He thought she was just a dramatic, hormonal pregnant woman who would drive around the block, cry it out, and come home, ready to talk. He was wrong. Her mind, once occupied with guest lists and dinner menus, began to work with a long, dormant, strategic precision. She pulled into a rest stop on the Mass Pike, the car engine ticking in the sudden quiet. She took out her iPhone, Rodney's face smiling back at her from the lock screen. A photo from Italy last summer. A lie. With a trembling finger, she powered it down. Then, she opened the glove compartment and removed a small, cheap burner phone she'd bought months ago. It wasn't that she had expected this exact scenario, but she had seen the small signs of Rodney's growing detachment, his late nights, at the office, the scent of that same perfume on his suit jacket weeks ago, which he'd dismissed as someone from work. A quiet, nagging instinct had told her to prepare a lifeline, a small act of self-preservation. She had also been quietly siphoning off small amounts from the household account into a separate bank account under her maiden name, Dorothy Brown. It wasn't much by Rodney's standards, just over $50,000, but to her, right now, it was the keys to a new kingdom. She turned on the burner phone and made her first call. It rang 3 times before a calm, familiar voice answered. "Timothy, it's Dorothy." Timothy Johnson had been her best friend in college. A brilliant, kind-hearted history major who had gone on to become one of Boston's most formidable divorce attorneys. They had lost touch after she married Rodney, a drift that Dorothy now realized Rodney had subtly engineered. "Dory, my God, is everything okay?" he asked, his voice instantly laced with concern. The dam broke. The carefully constructed calm shattered, and she began to sob, the ugly, gasping sounds of a heart breaking. "No, Tim. Nothing is okay. I came home. He was with someone. In our bed." She didn't have to say who. Timothy was silent for a moment, letting her cry. There was no pity in his silence, only a deep, anchoring empathy. "Where are you?" "On the pike. I don't know. I just left." "Okay, Dorothy. Listen to me. Don't go to your parents. Don't go to a friend's house. He'll look there first. Find a non-chain hotel, something small, and pay with cash. Your iPhone is off, right?" "Yes." "Good. He can track it. The CRV has a GPS locator tied to his security service. We need to ditch it. Tomorrow I'm going to wire you money from a client trust account. You'll use that cash to buy a used car, something forgettable. In the meantime, I want you to go to an ATM, 3 different ones, different banks, and pull out as much cash as you can from that account you have. Then lay low. Don't call anyone but me, and only from this phone. Are you with me?" His instructions were a lifeline in the storm. He wasn't just offering sympathy. He was giving her a plan. He was giving her back a sense of agency. "Yes, Tim, I'm with you." "Good girl," he said softly. "You're stronger than you think you are, Dory. He never deserved you." Meanwhile, back in Weston, Rodney Searles was growing impatient. After Tanya had hastily dressed and departed in an Uber, a slight smirk still on her face, Rodney had paced the bedroom. He'd called Dorothy's phone a dozen times, each call going straight to voicemail. He called her mother, who hadn't heard from her. He checked the tracker on her car, which showed her on the highway, heading west. "Damn it," he muttered. This was more than her usual sulk. It was inconvenient. He had a major merger to close next week. He didn't have time for this domestic drama. He poured himself a glass of Macallan 25, the amber liquid doing little to soothe his irritation. He looked around the silent, cavernous house. Dorothy's presence was everywhere, in the fresh flowers on the mantel, the curated art on the walls, the stack of baby-name books on the nightstand. Her absence was a void, and it unnerved him. He believed, with the unshakable arrogance of a man who had never truly faced consequences, that this was a negotiation. She was raising the stakes. She would eventually call, demand apologies, a ridiculously expensive piece of jewelry, a trip to Paris. He would capitulate, she would come home, and things would return to normal. He would just have to be more careful with Tanya in the future. He sent her a text message, confident it would eventually be delivered. "Dory, this is insane. Come home. We need to be adults about this. Think about the baby." He had no idea that the Dorothy he was texting no longer existed. Miles away, in a dingy motel room smelling of stale cigarettes and disinfectant, the Dorothy was methodically erasing herself. She withdrew cash, her face obscured by a hoodie. She used the motel's spotty Wi-Fi on a burner laptop to close all her social media accounts. She was a ghost, a phantom. She lay on the lumpy bed, one hand resting protectively on her swollen belly. The baby kicked, a gentle reminder of the life that was wholly hers, the one thing Rodney couldn't touch, couldn't control, couldn't devalue. He thought he had taken everything from her. But as she lay there in the anonymous dark, Dorothy Brown realized she had nothing left to lose. And that made her, for the first time in a very long time, powerful. 3 months passed. The fiery chaos of that August afternoon settled into the quiet embers of a cold, determined resolve. Rodney's initial annoyance had morphed into a simmering rage. Dorothy had not come home. She had not called. The text messages and voicemails, first placating, then demanding, then threatening, went unanswered. Her credit cards were unused. Her bank account was untouched after the initial cash withdrawals. She had vanished as completely as smoke. He hired a private investigator, a former cop with a bulldog face and a hefty price tag. The man, named Peterson, found the abandoned CRV in a long-term parking lot at a bus station in Albany, New York. The trail went cold there. Peterson assured Rodney that women like Dorothy always surfaced. "They need money, Mr. Searles. They get lonely. They make a mistake. We'll find her." Rodney's life in the glass house continued, but its flawless surface now showed hairline cracks. Tanya Dykes had moved in, her vibrant, modern possessions clashing with Dorothy's classic, understated taste. She filled the closets with her designer clothes and the bathrooms with her expensive perfumes, but her presence felt like a performance. The light, musical laughter that had once seemed so seductive now grated on Rodney's nerves. She was always on, ambitious, demanding, constantly angling for a more permanent position, for the ring, for the title of the next Mrs. Searles. She was a transaction, and Rodney was beginning to feel he'd made a bad deal. The comfortable, seamless ease Dorothy had provided was gone, replaced by a constant, low-level tension. Far from the brittle opulence of Weston, Dorothy Brown was breathing again. She had driven the used 2012 Toyota Camry she'd bought with cash to Asheville, North Carolina, a city nestled in the misty Blue Ridge Mountains. She rented a small, furnished, 2-bedroom apartment under her maiden name, paid the first 6 months' rent in cash, and introduced herself to her neighbors as Dana, a writer on a quiet retreat. Her life was simple, anonymous, and her own. She spent her days walking the winding mountain trails, the crisp autumn air filling her lungs. She discovered a small, independent bookstore where she'd spend hours reading, a cup of herbal tea growing cold beside her. She joined a prenatal yoga class, not the trendy competitive studio she'd attended in Weston, but a warm, welcoming space filled with women of all shapes and sizes. Here, she wasn't Rodney Searles' wife. She was just Dorothy, a woman about to become a mother. Her second bedroom was slowly transforming into a nursery. She painted the walls a soft, buttery yellow herself, bought a simple wooden crib from a local craftsman, and knitted a small, lopsided blanket. Each object was chosen with love, not for its brand name or its ability to impress. This life was authentic in a way her old one had never been. She spoke to Timothy Johnson once a week from her burner phone. He was her anchor, her strategist. He had quietly filed for a legal separation on grounds of irreconcilable differences, serving Rodney at his office. The move was designed to protect Dorothy's maternal rights and a portion of the marital assets without revealing her location. Rodney had been blindsided. The filing, delivered by a stoic process server in the middle of a board meeting, was a declaration of war. He had his own lawyers, a team of sharks from a top Boston firm, file a response, accusing Dorothy of being emotionally unstable, of kidnapping his unborn child. It was a vicious, calculated attack. "Don't let it get to you," Timothy told her during one of their calls. Dorothy was sitting on her small balcony, watching the sun set behind Mount Pisgah, painting the sky in hues of purple and gold. It's standard procedure for a narcissist with a bottomless war chest. They attack, they smear, they try to control the narrative. But we have the truth on our side, Dory. And more importantly, we have a plan. The plan was patience. Dorothy was to remain hidden, establish residency in North Carolina, and build a stable life for her child. The moment the baby was born, they would amend the filing and sue for full custody and divorce on her terms. But the solitude, while healing, was also a breeding ground for fear. Some nights she would wake up in a cold sweat, the memory of Rodney's fury, a tangible presence in the room. She would imagine him finding her, his expensive car pulling up outside her modest apartment building. The power he wielded, the money, the connections, felt like an insurmountable force. She would place a hand on her belly, feeling the strong, steady movements of her son, and draw strength from him. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for him. One chilly November evening, while she was online researching pediatricians, an unfamiliar name popped up in a local Asheville moms group on social media. Tanya Dykes has joined the group. Dorothy's blood ran cold. It had to be a coincidence. There could be hundreds, thousands of Tanya Dykeses in the world. She clicked on the profile. The picture was of a smiling, glamorous woman holding a glass of champagne on a yacht. The profile listed her location as Boston, MA. But why join a group in Asheville? Then she saw the post, made just an hour earlier. "Hi ladies, my partner and I are thinking of relocating to your beautiful city. He's in finance and can work from anywhere. We're looking for a family-friendly neighborhood with good schools. TIA for any recommendations." It wasn't a coincidence. They knew. Or they were close. The PI must have found something. A digital breadcrumb, a whisper. They were hunting her. The quiet sanctuary she had so carefully built was no longer safe. The storm she had outrun was gathering again, right on her doorstep. The digital intrusion felt like a home invasion. Dorothy stared at Tanya's smiling profile picture, the cheerful emoji at the end of her post a mocking grin. It was a probe, a baited hook cast into the quiet waters of her new life. They weren't in Asheville yet, but they were testing the ground, trying to flush her out. Panic seized her, cold and sharp. Her first instinct was to run again. Pack her bags, get in the car, and drive until the town was a speck in her rearview mirror. She stood up, her hands trembling, and paced the small living room. But where would she go? The world suddenly felt small, and Rodney's reach seemed impossibly long. She clutched her belly, the weight of her son a grounding force. No, she couldn't run forever. Running was what he expected. It was the act of a victim. She had spent the last 3 months building a life, not a hiding place. She would not let them tear it down so easily. She picked up the burner phone and called Timothy. Her voice was tight with fear as she explained what she'd found. "Okay, Dory, stay calm." Timothy's voice was steady, a rock in her sea of anxiety. "This is a tactic. They don't have your address. They probably don't even know for sure that you're in Asheville. Peterson, the PI, probably traced an IP ping or a data point to that geographic area. This is a fishing expedition. They're hoping you'll panic and make a mistake. What do I do, Tim? Nothing, he said firmly. You do absolutely nothing. You don't engage. You enhance your privacy settings, and you go about your life. But you stay vigilant. Lock your doors. Be aware of your surroundings. They've shown their hand. Now we wait. His confidence was a balm, but a seed of terror had been planted. Every unfamiliar car that drove down her street, every stranger's glance in the grocery store, felt like a threat. The peace she had found in the mountains was gone, replaced by a constant, humming dread. Back in Weston, the decision to probe Asheville had been Rodney's, born of sheer frustration. The PI, Peterson, had hit a dead end after finding the car. But a deep dive into Dorothy's old, deleted browser history had revealed searches from over a year ago for best small cities for artists and mountain town retreats. Asheville had been on the list. It was a long shot, but it was the only lead they had. "So you want me to just have your girlfriend join a mummy group?" Peterson had asked, his tone skeptical. "Mr. Surlees, that's not exactly standard procedure." "Just do it," Rodney had snapped. "Dorothy is predictable. She'll be looking for a community. She'll be nesting. If she's there, she'll see it. It might spook her into making a move." Tanya had been thrilled with the assignment. It made her feel like a partner in Rodney's quest, not just a live-in girlfriend. "Don't worry, Rod," she'd said, curling up next to him on the sofa that Dorothy had chosen. "We'll find her. And then you can finally put this all behind you, and we can move on with our life." But their life was unraveling. The novelty had worn off. Tanya's ambition, which had once seemed exciting, was now exhausting. She constantly talked about the future, marriage, a ring, their own children. She was trying to fit into Dorothy's life, but the fit was all wrong. One evening, during a tense dinner, Rodney, distracted by a business call, had unthinkingly said, "Could you pass the salt, Dory?" The silence that followed was deafening. Tanya's fork clattered onto her plate. "What did you just call me?" she asked, her voice dangerously quiet. "It was a slip of the tongue, Tanya. For God's sake." "It's been months, Rodney. She's gone. Why is she still living in your head?" Tanya stood up, her chair scraping against the floor. "I'm not her replacement. I'm not a placeholder you keep around while you obsess over your runaway pregnant wife. You need to choose. It's her or it's me." The ultimatum hung in the air. For a fleeting moment, Rodney felt an overwhelming sense of exhaustion. He was tired of Tanya, tired of the lawyers, tired of the search for Dorothy. He just wanted his quiet, orderly life back. He realized with a startling and unpleasant jolt that the peace he craved wasn't just an absence of conflict. It was the specific absence of conflict that Dorothy had so expertly managed for him. He hadn't just lost a wife. He'd lost his anchor. Weeks later, in the sterile, quiet environment of an Asheville hospital room, Dorothy's world shifted on its axis. After 12 hours of grueling labor, she gave birth to a healthy baby boy. She named him Ethan. Ethan Brown. Holding him for the first time, his tiny, wrinkled body warm against her chest, Dorothy felt a love so fierce and protective it eclipsed every other emotion. The fear, the anger, the betrayal, it all faded into the background. Looking into her son's deep blue eyes, she knew she wasn't a victim anymore. She was a mother, a warrior. The moment she was discharged from the hospital, she called Timothy. "He's here, Tim," she said, her voice thick with emotion as she gazed at Ethan sleeping in his car seat. "He's perfect. Congratulations, Dory," he said, and she could hear the genuine joy in his voice. "I'm so happy for you. Are you ready?" "Yes," she said, her voice ringing with a newfound strength. "Let's do it. Let's end this." The very next day, a process server walked into Rodney Searles's gleaming Boston office for the second time. He handed a stunned Rodney a new set of documents. They were not a response. They were an offensive, a petition for divorce on the grounds of adultery, a request for an emergency hearing to establish paternity, and sole legal and physical custody for Dorothy. Attached was a copy of Ethan Brown's birth certificate and a restraining order application, citing Rodney's increasingly aggressive behavior and use of a private investigator as harassment. Rodney stared at the papers, his face turning a dark, mottled red. The name Ethan Brown leaped off the page. Brown. She hadn't given him his name. She had erased him completely. This wasn't the frightened, emotional woman who had run out into the rain. This was a calculated strategic assault. She wasn't hiding in a corner, waiting to be found. She was on the attack. The power imbalance he had relied on his entire life had just been turned on its head. And for the first time, Rodney Searles felt a sliver of genuine fear. The legal documents landed on Rodney's antique mahogany desk like a declaration of war. His initial shock quickly hardened into a cold, seething fury. Sole custody, restraining order, harassment. The audacity was breathtaking. He had spent a fortune on the best legal team in Boston, and they had been outmaneuvered by Timothy Johnson, a man he vaguely remembered from Dorothy's college photos as a soft, intellectual type. "This is an ambush," he snarled into the phone at his lead attorney, a slick corporate lawyer named Marcus Thorne. "How did they get the jump on us like this? I'm paying you $700 an hour to be proactive." "They were patient, Rodney," Marcus said, his voice a calm counterpoint to Rodney's rage. "They waited until the child was born in North Carolina, establishing jurisdiction there. It's a smart move. It forces you to fight on their turf. And this adultery claim, do you have any exposure there?" Rodney thought of Tanya, who was at that very moment directing painters in what used to be Dorothy's home office, turning it into a garish pink dressing room. "It's a he said, she said situation," he lied, the words tasting like ash. "I hope so," Marcus said dryly, "because if they have proof, this custody battle gets exponentially harder for you. The judge won't look kindly on it." The battle lines were drawn. Rodney's legal strategy was to paint Dorothy as an unstable, vindictive woman who had fled her marriage in a fit of hormonal rage and maliciously kept a father from his child. They filed motions demanding a psychological evaluation for Dorothy and immediate DNA testing to establish paternity, framing it as a necessary step due to her erratic behavior. In Asheville, Dorothy read the filings with a knot of ice in her stomach. The words were a vile caricature of the truth, twisting her desperate act of self-preservation into a portrait of mental illness. "This is what they do," Timothy reassured her over the phone. He had flown down to meet with her and her new local counsel, a sharp, empathetic family lawyer named Sarah. "They throw mud, hoping some of it will stick, but we have something they don't. The truth. And we have proof." The proof was a simple, devastating thing. The day Dorothy had left, after Rodney had gone downstairs to see Tanya out, Dorothy had instinctively gone back upstairs. In a daze, she had seen Rodney's laptop open on his desk. On the screen was his calendar. Open to that day was an appointment. 2 p.m., Tanya. But it wasn't the appointment itself that was damning. It was the fact that it was a recurring weekly appointment, stretching back 6 months. With a trembling hand, she had taken her old iPhone, the one she would later abandon, and taken a clear, time-stamped photograph of the screen. It wasn't just a one-time mistake, as he'd claimed. It was a long-term, calculated affair. "We hold on to this for now," Timothy advised. "We don't play our best card at the beginning of the game. Let him build his fortress of lies. We'll knock it down when it matters most." The preliminary hearing was scheduled to take place via video conference, a cold and impersonal forum for such a deeply personal war. Dorothy sat at the polished table in Sarah's office, Ethan sleeping peacefully in a carrier at her feet. She wore a simple navy blue dress, her hair pulled back neatly. She looked composed, a stark contrast to the unhinged woman described in Rodney's legal filings. On the large screen, she saw him for the first time in nearly a year. He looked thinner, his face etched with lines of stress and anger. He sat in a high-tech conference room, flanked by Marcus Thorne and 2 junior associates. He refused to look at her, his gaze fixed stonily on the judge's image at the top of the screen. The hearing was a brutal, clinical dissection of her life. Rodney's lawyer painted her as a flighty, emotional housewife who had abandoned a loving, supportive husband. They presented her disappearance as proof of her instability. When it was Sarah's turn, she spoke with a calm, methodical precision. "Your Honor, my client, Ms. Brown, did not abandon her marriage. She fled a toxic and unsafe environment for herself and her unborn child. She left her home on August 28th of last year after discovering her husband, Mr. Searles, in the marital bed with his subordinate, Ms. Tanya Dykes." Rodney flinched on screen, a barely perceptible tightening of his jaw. Marcus Thorne immediately objected. "Objection, Your Honor. These are unsubstantiated and inflammatory allegations." "On the contrary, Your Honor," Sarah continued smoothly, "we have evidence that Mr. Searles was engaged in a long-term affair with Ms. Dykes, evidence we are prepared to present at trial. My client left to protect her child from the emotional distress of a volatile situation created entirely by Mr. Searles." The judge, a stern-faced woman in her 60s, peered over her glasses. "Mr. Searles, is it true that Ms. Dykes is currently residing with you in the marital home?" Rodney hesitated. Marcus whispered something in his ear. "Yes, Your Honor," Rodney said through gritted teeth. "She is a colleague who was in a difficult housing situation. I was offering her support. The lie was so pathetic, so transparent, that Dorothy almost felt a flicker of pity for him. He was a king with no clothes." The judge's expression was unreadable. "The court orders a DNA test to confirm paternity immediately. A guardian ad litem will be appointed to represent the interests of the child, Ethan Brown. Ms. Brown will retain temporary sole physical custody. Mr. Searles, given the circumstances and the distance, you are granted 2 hours of supervised virtual visitation per week. We will reconvene in 90 days to review the findings." It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. They hadn't fallen for his lies. As the video conference ended, Rodney's image lingered on the screen for a moment before blinking out. For the first time, his mask of controlled fury had slipped, replaced by a look of pure, undiluted shock. He had used his power and money to bully and control everyone in his life. He had just discovered they were useless against the simple, unassailable weapon of the truth. Tanya was waiting for him when he got home. "Well, what happened?" "She has temporary custody," he spat, throwing his briefcase onto a chair. "I have to see my son. My son, on a damn webcam with a court-appointed babysitter." "They can't do that," Tanya said, her voice rising. "You're his father. You have rights." "My rights," Rodney said with a bitter laugh, "are currently being dictated by the fact that the judge knows you're living here. My lawyer thinks your presence is complicating the narrative." The implication was clear. She wasn't an asset anymore. She was a liability. The triumphant victor who had watched Dorothy leave in the rain was now just another problem for Rodney Searles to manage. The foundation of her new life, built on the ruins of Dorothy's, was beginning to feel terrifyingly unstable. The 90 days leading up to the next hearing were a brutal war of attrition. Rodney's legal team inundated Timothy and Sarah with discovery requests, subpoenas, and depositions, a strategy designed to bleed Dorothy dry, emotionally and financially. They subpoenaed her college transcripts, her old employment records, even the prenatal yoga instructor in Asheville, looking for any scrap of information they could twist into a sign of instability. But Timothy had prepared her for this. Dorothy's life was an open book, and it was a book filled with quiet competence and stability. She had a master's degree in art history. Her old boss at the museum provided a glowing reference. Her neighbors in Asheville described her as a kind, devoted mother. The mud Rodney slung refused to stick. Meanwhile, the court-appointed guardian ad litem, a thoughtful and experienced social worker named Mrs. Gable, conducted her investigation. She interviewed Dorothy at length in her small, sunny apartment, observing her gentle, attentive interactions with Ethan. The home was modest but clean, safe, and filled with love. Her video conference with Rodney was a different story. He tried to charm her, presenting himself as a heartbroken father, desperate to be a part of his son's life. But Mrs. Gable was trained to see past such performances. She noted his repeated attempts to steer the conversation toward Dorothy's faults, his dismissive language when talking about the affair, a momentary lapse in judgment, and his visible frustration when discussing the supervised virtual visits. Those visits were an agony for everyone involved. Ethan, just a few months old, would often cry or sleep through them, while Rodney sat stiffly in his office, trying to engage with a baby on a screen. "Look, Ethan, it's Daddy," he'd say, his voice hollow. Dorothy had to remain present but out of frame, her heart aching for her son, who deserved better than this sterile, court-ordered parody of a father-son relationship. Back in Weston, Rodney's world was shrinking. The legal bills were astronomical, even for him. But more damaging was the slow leak of information about his messy divorce into his professional circle. Whispers followed him at the country club and in the boardroom. A man who couldn't control his own house, his own wife, was perhaps not as infallible as he seemed. A major investor pulled out of a new fund he was launching, citing concerns about instability in senior leadership. Tanya, feeling the walls close in, grew more desperate. "You have to do something, Rod," she'd insist. "You have to fight harder. Why are you letting her win?" He saw her then for what she was. Not a partner, but an echo of his own worst impulses. Greedy, entitled, and transactional. She wasn't a comfort. She was a constant, nagging reminder of the single stupidest mistake of his life. The breaking point came a week before the final hearing. Timothy called Dorothy. "It's time," he said. "We need a keystone, something to make their entire case crumble." Dorothy knew what he meant. For years, as the manager of the Searles household, she had been responsible for organizing all their financial documents for their accountant. She was meticulous, keeping digital and physical copies of everything. One year, she had noticed a strange recurring wire transfer of $100,000 every quarter to a shell corporation in the Cayman Islands called Searles Strategic Holdings. When she'd asked Rodney about it, he'd been uncharacteristically vague and angry. "It's complex investment stuff, Dory. You wouldn't understand. Don't worry about it." Sensing his agitation, she hadn't pushed. But she had made a copy of the statements, filing them away with a vague sense of unease. She had given that file to Timothy months ago. His forensic accountants had been quietly digging ever since. Rodney has been systematically hiding marital assets in that offshore account for the last 5 years, Timothy explained. It's a classic case of financial fraud against a spouse. But it's worse than that. The source of the funds is questionable. It seems to be linked to an insider trading investigation the SEC has been sniffing around for the past year. If this information were to be shared with, say, the U.S. Attorney's Office, he let the implication hang in the air. This was the keystone. This wasn't just about adultery or custody anymore. This was about Rodney's freedom. Timothy Johnson requested a settlement conference with Rodney and his lawyer. They met in a neutral conference room in Charlotte. Dorothy was not present. Timothy would be her sword and shield. Timothy laid it out. Not with malice, but with cold, hard facts. He presented the photograph of the calendar, proving the long-term nature of the affair. He presented the glowing report from the Guardian ad litem. And then he slid a single piece of paper across the table. It was a bank statement from Searle's Strategic Holdings. Rodney's face went pale. Marcus Thorne looked at the statement, then at his client, his eyes narrowing. "Here is our settlement offer," Timothy said calmly. "Dorothy gets sole legal and physical custody of Ethan. Rodney gets supervised visitation in Asheville 4 times a year at his own expense. He will pay a substantial, fixed amount in child support until Ethan is 21. In addition, Dorothy will receive 50% of all declared marital assets. In exchange for her signature on this agreement, that file," he tapped the bank statement, "remains a private matter between us." It was checkmate. Marcus Thorne looked at Rodney, whose arrogant facade had completely crumbled. He was a cornered animal. "Take the deal, Rodney," the lawyer advised in a low voice. Rodney left the conference room a broken man. He drove back to Weston in a daze. When he walked through the front door, Tanya was there, a glass of wine in her hand. "How did it go?" she asked, a hopeful lilt in her voice. "It's over," he said, his voice flat. "She won. She won everything." He slumped onto a sofa, the fight gone out of him. He looked at Tanya, at the pink dressing room down the hall, at the life he had chosen. It was all a cheap imitation, a hollow prize. Tanya stared at him, at his defeat. She had hitched her wagon to a star, and the star was falling from the sky. There would be no ring, no Mrs. Searle's title, no access to the limitless funds she had dreamed of. He was damaged goods. Without a word, she turned and walked upstairs. An hour later, she came down with 2 suitcases. She didn't look at him as she walked to the door. "Where will you go?" he asked, the question devoid of emotion. "Don't worry about me," she said, her voice hard. "I always land on my feet." She walked out the door, leaving him alone in the vast, silent glass house, a king in a kingdom of one. The laughter was finally gone. The divorce was finalized on a crisp, clear day in early spring. The paperwork, signed and sealed, felt less like an ending and more like a quiet, formal beginning. Dorothy sat in Sarah's office, the pen feeling light in her hand. There was no triumph, no desire for revenge, only a profound sense of peace. She had not destroyed Rodney. His own choices had done that. She had simply refused to be a casualty of his wreckage. The settlement was more than generous. It wasn't about the money itself, but what it represented: security, independence, and the freedom to give Ethan the life he deserved, a life built on a foundation of honesty and love, not glass and lies. A few weeks later, Rodney came for his first supervised visit. The meeting was at a neutral location, a bright, cheerful family center in Asheville. When Dorothy walked in, holding Ethan, she saw Rodney waiting with the court-appointed supervisor. He looked diminished. The bespoke suit hung a little looser on his frame. The confident swagger was gone, replaced by a hesitant uncertainty. He looked at Ethan, who was now nearly a year old, a happy, gurgling baby with a shock of dark hair like his father's, and Dorothy's calm blue eyes. Rodney's face, for the first time, showed a flicker of something beyond anger or self-pity. It was a raw, aching regret. He's beautiful, Dory," he stammered, his voice thick. "His name is Dorothy," she corrected him, gently but firmly. She handed Ethan over. Rodney held his son with an awkwardness that broke her heart a little. He had missed it all. The first smile, the first laugh, the sleepless nights, the tiny miraculous moments that forge the unbreakable bond between a parent and child. He was a stranger to his own son. She watched for a few minutes as he tried to play with Ethan, the supervisor looking on with a practiced, neutral expression. She saw the ghost of the man she had once loved, and the man he had become. He was no longer a monster in her mind, just a sad, flawed man who had broken the most precious things in his life. She walked over to him before she left. "I hope you can be a good father to him, Rodney. He deserves that." He looked up at her, his eyes filled with a galaxy of unspoken things, apologies, questions, regrets. "I know," he whispered. "I'm sorry, Dorothy, for everything." The apology, when it finally came, felt distant, like a message in a bottle that had washed ashore long after the ship had sailed. She didn't need it anymore. "Goodbye, Rodney," she said, and walked out into the sunshine, feeling nothing but light. Her redemption wasn't in his downfall, but in her own rise. She bought a small house with a wide porch and a view of the mountains. She started a small online art consultancy business, helping clients build their own collections. Her old passion, so long dormant, bloomed anew. Her life was filled with the quiet joys she had once craved. Ethan's laughter echoing through the house, the smell of paint and old books, the steady, comforting presence of good friends from her yoga class, the breathtaking beauty of a mountain sunset. She had walked out of the glass house with nothing but the clothes on her back and the child in her womb. She had been stripped of her name, her home, her security, but in losing everything, she had found herself. She was not Mrs. Dorothy Searles, the millionaire's wife. She was Dorothy Brown, a mother, a businesswoman, a survivor. She had faced the storm and walked out the other side, not just intact, but stronger, truer, and finally, breathtakingly free. Dorothy's story is a powerful reminder that the end of one chapter is often the beginning of a truly authentic life. She lost a marriage built on lies, but found a strength she never knew she possessed. Her journey from a shattered wife to a resilient, independent mother shows that our greatest trials can forge our greatest triumphs. It's a testament to the fact that true wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in peace, self-respect, and the courage to build a future on your own terms. What did you think of Dorothy's incredible transformation? Could you have found the strength to do what she did? Let us know in the comments below. Her story is one of betrayal, but ultimately of profound redemption and the quiet victory of a life well lived. If you were moved by her journey, please give this video a like, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and be sure to subscribe for more true-to-life stories that touch the heart. Thank you for watching.